Welcome back to the 69th online episode of Peacetime, hosted every Sunday morning by Peace Point with myself, Phra Nicholas Thanissaro, live streaming from our meditation centre in London. Last time you saw me, we looked at blessing number 27 on patience. With the Dhamma talk today, we'll continue in our series on enlightened living to the second blessing in the instilling oneself with higher virtues subsection. That is number 28 on openness to criticism. So today's session will run to about an hour and 10 minutes, starting with a 20-minute talk to define openness to criticism and the stubbornness it is supposed to overcome, then 30 minutes of meditation and 20 minutes on how to cultivate openness to criticism. We need to be open to criticism because many of our faults are less apparent to ourselves than they are to other people. According to the Buddhist proverb from the Dhamma part of verse 252, easily seen are the faults of others, but one's own faults are difficult to see. Like chaff, one winnows another's faults, but tends to hide one's own, even as the camouflage of a crafty fowler. Just like a fish born and raised in water may never know what water is, we are sometimes so used to our faults that we fail to notice them, which is why we need to rely on outsiders to offer feedback, to help us identify the shortcomings we need to improve upon. In this respect, we start to appreciate that the acquisition of higher virtues requires more than just the 4 levels of patience described in the previous blessing, namely patience in the face of life's hassles, patience in the face of life's hardships, patience in the face of interpersonal conflict, and patience in the face of temptation. What we need to bring the higher virtues to their fruition is the additional patience that allows us to be open to, rather than ignore, feedback offered to us by others. In fact, the openness to criticism, or not being stubborn, which is the subject of this blessing, is like another form of subtle patience, but it is patience in the face of criticism. Some people can tolerate all forms of hassle, hardship, interpersonal conflict, and temptation, but if anyone gives them a piece of advice, they get defensive. As examinations approach, a concerned parent might warn their boy, "Son, isn't it about time you started doing a revision?" But the son turns around and says, "Why didn't you think of saying that before I got dressed up to go out?" And our receptivity to the feedback often declines if the person offering feedback is a subordinate. The Buddha taught in the Sarabhanga Jataka, those who tolerate criticism from superiors do so out of fear. Those who tolerate criticism from equals do so only to compete. But those who tolerate criticism from subordinates, the noble ones praise as the ultimate of patience. So, who do you reckon is the most stubborn person in the world? In fact, everybody in the world has seeds of stubbornness in them, but it's just a question of degree. The sound of advice singes a person's ear so badly they cannot bear the sound. This is why we cannot avoid mastering openness to criticism to complete our soft skills needed for the instilling ourselves with higher virtues subsection of the 38 blessings. In the original Pali, openness to criticism uses the words sovacasata, which literally means being amenable to learning or being gentle in response to teaching. When a gap in a person's knowledge is pointed out, even if it is self-knowledge, then that person will appreciate and follow up on the advice given with respect and humility, without excuses or answering back. If they are informed about a personal shortcoming, they will hear the other person out, then work on improving their habits without showing reluctance, all the while cognizant of the trouble the critic has taken to bring that new knowledge to their attention. The diametric opposite of openness to criticism is stubbornness. Some people think that responding to criticism should be simple. After all, you merely need to quit your stubbornness, while calmly bringing to mind all the opportunities stubbornness can cause us to miss. Unfortunately, it is easier said than done. So, to get to the root of the stubbornness problem, we need to deconstruct it. In the Anumana Sutta, the Venerable Moggallana Thera listed as many as 16 possible features of stubbornness in the face of criticism. Many of the 16 features mentioned overlap with those in the Upakilesa Sutta, which is also in the Majjhima Nikaya. Those subtle traits are already known to be features of stubbornness more generally and include things like greed, covetousness, stinginess, obstinacy, rigidity, vanity, and recklessness, and as such would be a topic for a completely different lecture series. But if we want to keep life simple by looking at the features relevant to stubbornness in the face of criticism, we can reduce the number down to just 5, and we'll look at each of these in turn. First possible feature of stubbornness in the face of criticism is being unable to control oneself when angry. For example, by stamping your feet or tearing out your hair, yelling or slamming doors. If you meet anyone like this, you will be taking a big risk if you try to pass on advice. The second possible feature of stubbornness in the face of criticism is always having to have the last word, which, like egomaniacs more generally, means that they are unable to control what they say when criticized. A third possible feature of stubbornness in the face of criticism is being the sort of person who has an excuse for everything. A person who is advised to sit for meditation rather than lying down will find an excuse for ignoring the advice, such as successful meditation means you have to be comfortable in body and mind. Lying down is the most comfortable for me. I don't see it interfering with anyone else's meditation. If you meet such people, it will be a waste of time trying to change their ways. However, if you recognize the same tendency in yourself, be quick to do something about it. The fourth possible feature of stubbornness in the face of criticism is being the sort of person who always has a malicious way of answering back. In other words, responding to a critic in a way that will hurt them. They will say something like, "Don't go worrying about me, you'd be better off sorting out the problems in your own life." Instead of accepting criticism, they ignore the advice and turn it back on their critic. The fifth and final possible feature of stubbornness in the face of criticism is changing the subject to avoid speaking about the matter. Since they cannot deny the accusation, they and ah, beat about the bush and digress instead. Like all the features highlighted, if we can gradually reduce these knee-jerk responses to criticism one by one, we will gradually work the stubbornness out of our system. From what is known about the nature of stubbornness, 3 distinct categories can be identified, and the difference is important because it affects how they can be dealt with. Firstly, there are those who are stubborn because of ignorance. Since they may not be the sharpest tool in the shed, they may be oblivious to the value of the advice, if not out of ignorance, and because they're too lazy to change. For such people, encouraging them to change may be too labor-intensive. It is as if they are stubborn without realizing it. At heart, such people may prefer the clarity of just being told to do things rather than being persuaded by elaborate reasons. In fact, eloquent reasoning might be considered casting pearls before swine, to use a New Testament metaphor. The second sort of stubbornness is those who are stubborn because of intransigent views. In fact, they may be very intelligent people, but only in terms of IQ rather than EQ. Unfortunately, they may not realize the limits of their knowledge or the gaps in their experience. They assume they already know everything there is to know, and they are beyond reproach and can make themselves unpopular in the workplace because they are unable to accept advice from anyone else. Often co-workers are resigned to leave them to their ignorance, letting them learn from their own mistakes. For this second category of stubborn people, generally they would be averse to being ordered around, but need reasons, explanations, and choices for the things that you would like them to help with. If they are not too entrenched in their own views, they can eventually be won round to another person's point of view, given a good reason. However, if their views are extremely rigid, you will have to let them do what they insist and step in with compassionate advice when they start getting themselves in trouble. This sort of stubbornness has often been compared to a frog at the bottom of a well that thinks it knows the whole of the world because it already knows the bottom of a well. This category of stubbornness is also connected with the Buddhist Brahmadaṇḍa treatment or punishment, which we will hear about later on in the lecture. Traditionally, giving advice to stubborn but dim-witted people has been compared to watering a tree stump. In other words, it is a fairly useless gesture, but you might at least get a few mushrooms as a result. However, advice given to an opinionated, stubborn person is like pouring water on a dog. The dog gains nothing from the water and will shake itself until everyone else is wet instead, because they will answer back, turning the criticism on the person who gave it. Lastly, there's a third sort of stubbornness that arises when people are short-tempered. These will lose their temper upon hearing the slightest thing they disagree with. It's very hard to get any cooperation from such people who are likely to wreak disharmony in a group, and it's not obvious how to solve this problem of stubbornness either. It's rare to find someone who can genuinely take criticism on board, and just because someone seems to accept criticism doesn't automatically mean that they are motivated by self-improvement. They may be materially motivated or just easily led. Those who are materially motivated to be open to criticism are usually sycophants who make themselves obsequious because they hope for something material in return. Children seemingly devoted to their parents might just want to be remembered in their parents' will. Usually stubborn people change their tune whenever they are close to influential people, in case they miss a chance at promotion. Generally, such people are only compliant to your face, but behind your back will behave completely differently. The second category of those who are open to criticism but in an unskillful way are those who are just easily led. Such people look compliant and obedient, but they are not selective. Usually they lack any initiative of their own and follow the last advice they have been given, whether it's good or bad, without due thought. If they're advised to go to school, then they'll go. Equally, if they're advised to cut lessons, then they will stay away. Their direction in life is as unselective as a leaf in the wind. Lastly, there are those, hopefully including everyone listening today, whose motivation to be open to criticism is for spiritual improvement or transformation. Feedback from others is treated as treasure that will help them towards the goal of perfection. Only this last category aligns with the openness to criticism advocated in the Blessings of Life. So today, just before we come to time for some meditation, let me leave you with a quick scriptural story about how a stubborn person was misled for their own good. In the time of the Buddha, the kingdom of Ujjaini was ruled by a king called Channa DhA.ii.110ff. This king had a name for being so stubborn and bad-tempered that when he succumbed to jaundice, they could not find anyone in his own kingdom who would agree to treat him. A letter was sent to King Bimbisara in an adjoining kingdom, requesting the court physician called Jīvaka to take care of Channa DhA.ii.110ff. Normally in the treatment, the patient must swallow ghee to be cured. In this case, Channa DhA.ii.110ff stubbornly refused treatment because he had a violent aversion to dairy products. Jīvaka considered the king's prognosis and realized it would be hopeless if he didn't agree to ingest ghee, so he made what may have been the world's first capsule by concealing the ghee inside a digestible husk. Jīvaka knew that after about half an hour, the medicine would take effect and the king would regurgitate the ghee. Besides being cured, the king would know that he'd been misled by the doctor. Jīvaka administered the ghee capsule to the king and immediately requested the king's fastest elephant to go looking for additional herbs. The king granted the request and Jīvaka made a quick getaway, without any intention to return. When the king regurgitated the ghee and knew he had been fooled, he ordered his soldiers to pursue and kill Jīvaka, but Jīvaka was long gone on the fastest elephant in the stables, and they could not catch him. The king was angry all day and all night, but within a few days he found out he'd been cured of his illness and changed his attitude to Jīvaka, even sending him a reward of Sivayaka cloth to thank him for his attention. From that day onwards, Channa DhA.ii.110ff made the effort to change his stubborn personality. So now that we are a little more well-informed about the nature of true openness to criticism and the perils of stubbornness, let's cultivate gentleness of mind by settling ourselves down for 30 minutes of meditation, which today is a recent recording of the Shared Spiritual Path meditation. If at this time you'd like to find a comfortable sitting position for yourself as you listen to my guidance. So if you'd like to settle yourself down into a comfortable position for your meditation today, closing your eyes very gently, and breathing deeply to yourself, while letting go of any tensions in your body, all the way from the top of your head, right the way down to the tips of your toes. And in this body scan of ours, we can allow the muscles of our face to become soft, taking care that even the way we've closed our eyes is as gentle as possible. Bearing in mind that the muscles around our eyes are the most sensitive in our body. And if we can close our eyes gently, then the whole of the rest of our body will relax in just the same way. So we allow that wave of relaxation to pass down through our face to our neck and shoulders, relaxing all the muscles there, relaxing both arms, forearms, hands and fingers, so that the way our hands rest in our lap should feel as light and gentle as possible. Continuing on down, we relax all the muscles of our torso, whether it be our chest, trunk, or abdomen. Relaxing both legs, all the way down to our feet and our toes, until the whole of our body seems to melt away into the atmosphere around us, comfortable enough to allow us to forget about the body and turn our attention instead to the feeling inside us, inside the space of our body, where we can also spend a few moments to make sure our state of mind is as relaxed as our body. So ideally, our state of mind should feel awake and alert, but also relaxed. Picking up on the energy of solidarity with like-minded meditators in our group, because there's always a sharing of the inspiration to meditate that brushes off on all around us and gives us a sense of belonging. So at this point we can withdraw our awareness within the space of our own body to a place inside ourselves that feels free of any worries and concerns. Although there may be things going on in our busy lives, but we've set aside a special time for ourselves to recover and relax our sense of well-being. So we conjure up a sense of happiness, joy and freedom in the mind, while putting aside any unwanted thoughts. And as we nurture the sense of happiness and joy inside ourselves, we allow that same feeling to grow and expand within ourselves until there's no space left in our mind for any other sort of thought. Ideally, we'll feel as if our whole body is light in weight, expanding, or as if it's disappeared altogether into the atmosphere around us. And at this point, for those of you who feel ready, you can start to practice your favorite method of meditation now that your body and mind are completely relaxed. But for those of you who are new to meditation or who favor the Dhammakaya approach, I'd invite you to imagine that inside your body is just an empty space or a hollow cavity with no organs or tissues, muscles or bones. Almost as if your whole body has been transformed into a hollow shell with nothing on the inside. In order to act as a sort of anchor for the mind, you might like to picture a bright object in your mind's eye, such as a full moon shining, a shining sun, maybe a twinkling star, or a sparkling diamond. And even if you can't directly see that object, you may find that the feeling of the presence of that object will work just as well. You may feel as if you have one of those objects floating within the space of your body. And at this point, you can allow the object to float gently down within the space of your body, following the breath down to its deepest point at the diaphragm, a place known in this tradition as the seventh base of the mind. But in fact, anywhere in that general area which feels comfortable for you will work just as well. We maintain our mind in place lightly and gently by means of the inner object that we've imagined, as continuously as we can, for as long as we can, not letting our mind wander off anywhere else if we can help it. But if the mind should wander off, as inevitably happens, we just bring it back again each time to the center as before. And if the inner object disappears, then we can think of a new one. If we notice that thoughts interrupt our meditation, we do our best to ignore them rather than elaborate on them. But if we find the mind becomes plagued by thoughts, if we find our brain is working like the proverbial hamster wheel, we might find it useful to make use of a traditional mantra, such as hearing the sound of the words Samma Arahang, Samma Arahang, Samma Arahang, coming up from the center of the body over and over again until the mind starts to gain independence from those thoughts, until the spaces between the thoughts start to last longer than the thoughts themselves. In effect, meditation is unique in the way over thousands of years it has contributed to human spirituality culture, bringing a sense of grace and meaning to the lives of all who practice, while fostering honesty, compassion, and respect for all living beings. And in the present age, the need for humility and deep empathy are so essential for the well-being of all on our planet. So as we meditate today, we can make the resolve to ourselves to continue to work together to build the lives of peace and dignity for all on a healthy planet. There are so many benefits that arise from coming together to explore this shared spiritual path that can lead all practitioners to become free from suffering, while touching progressively upon an inner experience of enlightenment. And as we gradually shed the shortcomings from the mind, whether it be grasping, malevolence, or delusion, by letting go of the unmindful, the uncomprehending, the unconcentrated, residues of our wandering mind and faculties, as we move incrementally closer to that inner space of purity, we'll start to find that it doesn't actually matter what technique we started out with, or where we meditate. But any place we practice meditation, even at home, even if we're unable to go to a meditation center in person, will help to bring ourselves closer to the seventh base of the mind, a point in the body which is a portal that leads the mind deeper towards wisdom. And any approach to the meditation that internalizes the mind within the body will eventually converge with that shared spiritual path. So ultimately they will all lead to inner wisdom. So at this point I'd like to encourage everyone to continue to practice meditation, keeping the mind on track lightly and gently, with our inner object at the center of ourselves, as we continue to focus the mind gently in peace at the center of the body for a few more moments until we come to the appropriate time. when you're new to meditation, you may find that there are so many things popping up in the mind. It's as if its busyness never ceases. Sometimes like the ocean waves, one after the other, with those thoughts coming and going the whole of the time. But if we allow those thoughts to come and go, accepting that this is how the mind is, without getting worried or upset about it during the meditation itself, we'll find that the less we worry about it, the more we accept the reality, just acknowledging and bringing ourselves back to our meditational object, then we'll gradually become master of our own mind, rather than a slave to our own distractions. So if you find your mind is wandering off onto other things, each time you realize, you can just bring your attention back again to the center of the body as before. Bring our attention back to the center of the body for as many times as it takes to build up that sense of continuity between your awareness and that special place at the center of yourself. As you continue to cultivate the mind in this way, you'll find that the number of the thoughts becomes gradually less, with or without the mantra. You find the gaps between the thoughts gradually become longer, until the gaps between the thoughts become longer than the thoughts themselves. And you'll start to be able to see through to what lies beneath the thoughts in the mind, beneath that superficial layer of left brain thinking. You'll start to be able to access more intuitive places in the mind, a deeper level of the subconscious, gut feelings, inner wisdom, until you reach a point where the thoughts die down completely, and you'll start to have a permanent connection to those deeper gifts of the mind. But for now, we keep our mind on track, lightly and gently, keeping our mind in place with nothing more than a feather-light touch. Each to our own practice for a few more moments now in silence, until we come to time for some loving-kindness meditation. So we continue to keep our mind on track at the center of the body as continuously as we can, for as long as we can, always at the center of whatever inner experience we've built up for ourselves as a result of our meditation so far today. Whether it be in the form of a feeling of well-being at the center of ourselves, a sense of illumination within ourselves, or images within us, large or small. We place our mind gently at the center of that inner experience. And if we place our awareness exceedingly gently, there will be a sense of melting away, which allows that inner experience to spread outwards from the central point, almost like ripples spreading across the surface of a pond around the place where a pebble has been thrown in, spreading in ever-widening circles from the epicenter. And in this way we spread positive peace energy from the center of ourselves, initially to fill the whole of our body, every fiber of our being, every cell and molecule of our body. And this process of spreading is known as loving kindness. And initially we extend a loving kindness towards ourselves with a sense of self-compassion, a love for who we are, at the very least a sense of acceptance and a sense of forgiveness. Because we need to love ourselves first before we can have love to share with others. Wishing ourselves to be well and happy, free from all suffering, before allowing that same spreading of loving kindness to extend beyond the boundaries of our own body, outwards into the room around us, almost like a halo or an aura, outwards towards other sentient beings, to the whole building. From there radiating outwards into our entire neighborhood, with the positive intention as our loving kindness spreads to the living beings in our midst, sharing that state of peace and happiness as we let it grow further, expanding to the entire town and county, to all sentient beings or people, no matter where they are or who they might be, with a wish that all those living beings be touched by our loving kindness, our sense of love and compassion, which dispels all negativity, all the negative elements that affect the world, gradually disappearing as the loving kindness spreads further and further across the surface of our planet, above and beyond borders and boundaries, extending its warmth and compassion to every living being, every creature sharing this planet, with a tide of loving kindness, which you may experience as a sense of well-being or extending light that shines outwards from your center towards the whole of the world, to bring a state of happiness and contentment, with the wish that all sadness, sorrow, or aggression be swept away by the beauty of this compassion. Just like a single candlelight can be used to light many more candles until eventually the collected light becomes resplendent, dispelling darkness. In the same way, from one person or two spreading love and kindness, the tide of compassion, acceptance, peace, and harmony can become tangible in the same way. So we make the wish for ourselves and for all the sentient beings around us, that they may be touched by this sense of inner peace, love and compassion, that all their negativity be swept away. We can also extend loving kindness to particular loved ones, family members, relatives and friends, wherever they may be, whether they are still alive or whether they have already passed, feeling them at our center and extending that energy of peace along with our loving kindness, along with our good wishes for them to be well and happy. We extend positive wishes for all without exception, with a sense of gratitude and appreciation, extending a sense of the light of peace and harmony throughout the world in this way for the last few moments of our practice together. Sapphe Buddha Balapata Pajjeka Nanchayam Balang Arahanta Nanchate Jena Rakam Bandami Sapaso Sappa Buddha Nupavena Sappa Dhamma Nupavena Sappa Sankha Nupavena Satha Soti Bhawantute. So if you'd like to come to the end of your meditation for today, and you can gradually open your eyes again. If you feel at all uncomfortable, then slowly try changing to a more comfortable position before gradually finishing your practice. So to come gently back to our subject matter for today, let's see what we can learn about how to handle constructive criticism gracefully. A lot of the advice we shall hear revolves around defusing the particularly painful Asian phenomenon of loss of face. But even in the West, accepting criticism from others is by no means an easy matter, which is a pity because, although praise may make you feel good, critique makes you better, and you need to accept both compliments and criticism, just as it takes both sun and rain for a flower to grow stronger. Applying the feedback you receive from others, whether it's from a mentor or a peer, can help you be more successful and reach the dreams you've set for yourself, while exceeding others' expectations of you. Fortunately, the mechanism by which even ordinary people can go about handling constructive criticism can be planned for. So let's examine the nature of the process of remaining open to criticism in 4 stages. Our first reaction, our attitude of mind and disposing ourselves while receiving criticism, and finally the follow-up. The very first thing we need to do when taken by surprise by someone else's unsolicited feedback is to stop our initial reaction. At the first sign of criticism, before you do anything, just stop. Try not to react at all. You'll probably have about 1 second to freeze your reflexes. While 1 second might not seem like very long in real time, it's enough time for you to process in your brain and get a handle on what is happening. And in that moment, you can halt any dismissive facial expression or scathing comeback and remind yourself to stay calm. The first response most of us have when it comes to receiving even well-meaning criticism is to get defensive. That defensive fight or flight response may manifest itself as denial, burning rage, or stammering. As much as your chest feels tight and your face reddens, hearing our criticism may teach you something valuable. Even the most painful comments can teach us something about ourselves. So, from the start, just keep your mouth shut, inactivate your defenses, and listen to what that other person has to say. Second piece of advice is to avoid answering back when singled out for feedback. Some people will immediately criticize someone back as soon as they hear a few words of advice. If a person is truly sensitive to self-improvement, they will not protest in return or make excuses when they are given advice, but accept the advice with humility. The third piece of advice is not to turn a deaf ear when given advice, unlike people who claim they are practicing patience by ignoring the advice that's been given. The fourth piece of advice is to remain tolerant even to the advice that comes in the form of unpleasant speech. Sometimes the person who offers us the advice might already be irritated or in a bad mood, especially if our substandard behaviour has upset them. So it's hardly surprising that they may speak a little harshly or use comparisons that are a little direct. Consequently, we, the listener, need to be tolerant of how the message might be delivered and not be angry as a result. So that was all advice for the initial reaction at the start of criticism. As the feedback session proceeds, we need to engage with more sustained attitudes of mind and decorum. So let's start by considering the attitude of mind we need. First piece of advice on an attitude to mind while being criticized is to have no intention to find fault in return with the person who has given us the advice. In other words, don't shoot the messenger with comebacks like, "How come you're the only person to say such a thing?" We need to assume the comments are for our own benefit, and that whether we accept the advice or not is no skin off their nose. Second piece of advice on attitude of mind to have while being criticized is to have the highest respect for the person and their advice. This means putting aside any expression of reluctance. Whether the advice is right or wrong at this stage, we need to accept that anyone who has gone out of their way to give us the advice is taking a big personal risk, because they know they might get their head bitten off, and yet they still offer up the advice. So, the recipient of criticism, we need to put aside thoughts like, "How dare they criticize me?" or "Who are they to criticize me?" The third piece of advice is to train yourself in gratitude, because the trouble they have gone to criticize us shows that they care enough about us to have high expectations. So even if you don't agree 100% with what you have been criticized for, hear out the criticism instead of rushing to pick a fight with them. Fourth piece of advice on attitude of mind to have when being criticized is to show the greatest humility, which means accepting criticism without assuming that you're beyond reproach. A third piece of advice on attitude of mind to have while being criticized is don't take it personally. In fact, some business magazines like Inc. advocate the adoption of the 3-word mantra, "Don't feel attacked." Assume that the person offering constructive criticism does not intend to make you feel bad about yourself. Rather, they recognize your strengths and are giving you the tools to recognize and overcome shortcomings. It's up to you to turn that feedback into something positive that motivates you to keep working hard and improve. Some people have a tendency to react negatively even to constructive criticism. They might try to defend themselves or escalate the tone of the conversation. However, it's better to stay calm and really listen to what the person has to say in order to be receptive to their advice. You should also try to curtail any reaction you're having to the person who's delivering the feedback. It can be challenging to receive criticism from a co-worker, a peer, or someone that you don't fully respect, but remember, accurate and constructive feedback comes even from flawed sources. In other words, keep an open mind to allow you to properly engage yourself in the process. Only when the person giving the feedback has finished sharing their thoughts would it be an appropriate time to think about what they've said and begin to self-examine. A sixth piece of advice is to own it. There's no denying it. It's tough to hear ways that you're not perfect. So really absorb the criticism. You'll feel it all the way to the bone. Nevertheless, you need to take responsibility for what went wrong. Lots of people don't own up to their mistakes. They put the blame on someone else, and it keeps them from improving. Only once you own it can you get better. The seventh piece of advice on attitude of mind to have while being criticized is to reflect on the harm brought by obstinacy. If you close the door on useful advice others might have for you, you are behaving like a paralyzed person surrounded by useful objects, none of which they can reach. Similarly, a stubborn person may be surrounded by those in the know, but they can gain nothing from those people. Final piece of advice on attitude of mind to have when being criticized is to reflect, in accordance with the Buddha's advice at Dhammapada verse 76, that criticism is hidden treasure. So that implies that a person who has given us personal advice and criticism is pointing the way to that treasure. Just take a few seconds to quickly remind yourself of the benefits of receiving constructive criticism, and it will help to sweeten the bitter medicine. Turning to look now at how we need to behave during the feedback session. First piece of advice on how to behave when being criticized is to mind your manners. Anyone who's open to criticism must resist the temptation to have a meltdown or be unpleasant to the person giving the advice. A second piece of advice on how to behave when being criticized is to listen for understanding. You should not be afraid or embarrassed to find out about your faults, because the hallmark of wisdom is never to be sufficed as to new knowledge. So, having avoided defensive reactions, your brain is now working fully and you have recalled all the benefits of feedback. Yay! So now you're ready to engage with a productive dialogue as to your competent, thoughtful self, as opposed to your temperamental inner child. As that well-meaning person shares the feedback with you, listen closely. Allow that person to share their complete thoughts without interruption. At this point, avoid analyzing or questioning the person's assessment. Instead, just focus on understanding their comments and perspective, and give them the benefit of the doubt here, because by recognizing that the person giving you feedback may also be nervous or may not express their ideas perfectly. The third piece of advice on how to behave when being criticized might be to write down criticism to make it less personal, and maybe to store away and look at again more objectively after the event. You might even privately write down what bothers you about the criticism that you just received, but this part would be something you wouldn't want to share with other people. The fourth piece of advice on how to behave when being criticized is to ask questions to deconstruct the feedback. Once your critic is done with their rant, you might repeat back to them what you've heard. For example, you might say, "I hear you saying that you want me to provide more detailed weekly reports. Is that right?" Since you'll probably want to get more clarity at this point, you can confirm that you've heard correctly without engaging in a debate or questioning their judgment. Instead, ask questions to get to the root of the actual issues being raised and possible solutions for addressing them. For example, if a colleague tells you that you got a little heated in a meeting, you might seek specific examples to help you understand the issue. "I admit I was a little frustrated, but can you share when in the meeting that you thought I got heated?" Acknowledge the feedback is not in dispute. "You're right that I did cut him off when he was talking, and later I did apologize for that." Try to understand whether this is an isolated issue or a habitual one. In other words, was it just a mistake that you made once? "Have you noticed me getting heated in other meetings?" is an example of what you could ask. Ask for concrete solutions to address the feedback, such as, "I'd love to hear ideas on how I might handle this differently in the future." To grow, you might want to make sure you fully understand the person criticizing you, and questions are especially important if the criticism received wasn't particularly clear. By asking these clarifying questions, you're having a conversation with your critic, and this can help to improve cooperation. Final piece of advice on how to behave when being criticized, if you respond at all, is to respond appropriately. If you don't agree with the criticism and you are sure it is not just your ego in the way, you can tell the criticizer that, especially if it's unfairly defamatory or damaging to your character. Instead of using an angry tone, try responding by saying something like, "I didn't realize I came across that way. Thanks for sharing your opinion. From my side, it seems like," at which point you share your perspective. "From my perspective" is an incredibly useful phrase to have at the ready. In this respect, you need to accentuate the positive. Your critic is not looking for you to defend yourself, but rather to make sure that you hear what they are saying and that you are planning to incorporate the feedback into your future behavior. So don't behave like you're on trial, but rather try to respond by pointing out the positive. Finally, we come to the follow-up for the feedback session. And the first very important piece of advice on how to complete a feedback session is to express your happiness and gratitude at having received the advice. At the time of the Buddha, they would express their appreciation with the word sadhu. But however you're left feeling, make sure you say thank you to that person immediately. However, if you still have the remnants of stubbornness in your mind when you receive even correct criticism, the words thank you seem to get stuck in your throat. So although it may be very hard, look the person in the eye and thank them for sharing feedback with you. Don't gloss over this. Be deliberate and say, "I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me about this." Expressing appreciation doesn't have to mean that you are agreeing with the assessment, but it does show that you're acknowledging the effort your colleague has taken to evaluate you and to share their thoughts. A second piece of advice on how to complete a feedback session is to facilitate further teaching in order to keep open the channels of communication. You certainly will need to follow up on the advice, acting on what you've been told in a way that will give the advisor the encouragement to pass on any future advice to you if the need arises. Hopefully, by this point in the conversation, you can agree on the issues that were raised. Once you articulate what you will do going forward, rather than repeating the irksome behavior just to prove our point, once we know we're in the wrong, we need to accept this and do the right thing rather than the easy one. That said, if it's a larger issue or something presented to you by your boss, you may want to ask for a follow-up meeting to ask more questions and get agreement on next steps. If this is the case, then you may need to request time to follow up, which may be good because it'll give you time to process the feedback, seek advice from others, and think about solutions. It will give us the opportunity to clarify any misunderstandings, as well as share our side of the story from a settled state of mind and keep the dialogue productive and professional. Third piece of advice on how to complete a feedback session is to follow the advice to the appropriate extent. Given that sometimes the advice is not 100% justified, just try out the advice for size and see if there's any truth in it. Often we have to accept that it's more important to be seen to be following the advice than the actual content of the advice itself. At the very least, our critic will not be put off from giving us future advice further down the road. Fourth piece of advice on how to complete a feedback session is to do something nice for yourself. It may sound silly, but being open to criticism can leave you feeling vulnerable. Take a minute to do something nice for yourself. Sometimes treating yourself can help to give you space to understand how best to move forward. And the fifth and final piece of advice is to meditate often and regularly. If we can train our mind to the point of radiance and steadfastness, it will allow us to reflect wisely on the advice given to us by others, seeing how such advice can be applied to improve our personal weaknesses. In conclusion, you can't get better without a map of the direction toward improvement. Although feedback can be painful to hear, growth happens when we are equipped with the knowledge to move forward. So in the meantime, keep an open mind and recognize that the person who's giving you the advice just wants to see you succeed. And at this juncture, it might be reassuring for you to know that it's not just ordinary layfolk, but even monks who struggle with accepting criticism. In fact, monks can sometimes be some of the worst culprits. Particularly, Buddhist suggestions for correction of stubborn habits for monks come from the tradition called Pavarana, laid down by the Buddha that monks should improve on themselves by inviting others in their community to give their criticism, whatever their relative rank or status. In the rainy season, monks must stay in the same location for 3 months, but at the end of the period, the Buddha made it an item of monastic discipline that all the monks in the temple, right from the abbot down to the most junior monk, should meet together and make the invitation to one another to correct each other's behaviour with a sense of goodwill. The words used in the ceremony go something like this, and I quote, "If any of you have seen, heard, or suspected any behaviour of mine that was unpleasant in any matter, please inform me of such errors out of compassion, so that I might realise my own faults and be more careful of my behaviour in the future." So even the most junior monk has the opportunity to voice any criticism that they wouldn't dare to give at another time of the year. So it's a little bit like open season or amnesty on criticism just for one day, which is allowed at the end of the 3 months of the rainy season, Lent. Even monks have personal faults they need to overcome, and other monks' perceptions of these might be right or wrong. Nonetheless, the opportunity to be open with others in the same community can help to reduce any interpersonal tensions. Everyone tends to think it's okay to take a few liberties here and there, or that these liberties are not bothering anyone else. But in reality, they probably are bothering other people, but they just don't want to mention it. For example, if monks are older, then they tend to keep themselves to themselves a little bit, and they might snore, or they might get up in the middle of the night, and they might disturb others. So, old monks have got certain sorts of shortcomings. The young monks have got certain shortcomings of their own because they like to talk excitedly all the time or go to bed late. So unless there's an airing of the way one side sees the other, then there's potential for interpersonal conflict. So part of letting go of stubbornness is being open to how we might impact others. It's an example of the golden rule of treating others as we might like to be treated ourselves, and it saves having to walk on eggshells around others in our community the whole of the time. Even if you are not a monk, you can make opportunities to receive feedback. You probably don't need to go to the lengths of posting a public message on Twitter or Facebook, inviting people to share their criticisms of you. Otherwise, you might get more than you bargained for. However, you might get some of the same benefits achieved in the monastic Pawarana tradition simply by offering others you live with or work with the chance to speak up on occasion. It's very effective as a way of making sure that the issues are aired within a family or a team, which otherwise would grind each other down over the years. In spite of how uncomfortable feedback sessions are, their utility cannot be denied. If children are trained in such a way from an early age, then they can minimize their negative traits before they become too serious to avoid disadvantages of stubbornness later in life. So it might be something where openness to feedback is the first step towards empathy in accommodating people's different natures and worldviews. The important thing once you receive the criticism or feedback is that you need to reflect on it. What you have been told may be true or may not be true, but at least give it fair consideration to see whether there's any truth in it from what you've heard from the others who have taken the trouble to give you the feedback in the first place. So, just while we are on the subject of monastic stubbornness, we have time for a quick related story. In the time of the Buddha, when he renounced his life as a prince in the palace to ordain, he left the palace on horseback together with a charioteer called Channa. Channa also ordained later in life, but throughout his monkhood, he was unable to make progress in the teachings of Buddhism. The reason for this was that he would selfishly do whatever he felt like doing and would ignore the advice of all the other monks in the community. He was so proud of having accompanied the Buddha when the Buddha renounced the palace that he thought the whole of the Buddhist community should be in his debt. He was not ready to listen to anyone else's advice because he considered them all ungrateful. He would not listen to anyone but the Buddha himself. However, the Buddha didn't have enough time to give Channa personal attention, so he ended up as a stubborn monk. Ananta, who was the secretary to the Buddha, asked the Buddha, "What can we do with this monk? Because when you eventually pass away, there will be no one left who can guide him." The Buddha replied, "If he is still stubborn after my death, you must apply the Brahmadaṇḍa punishment, which means just let him do whatever he wants to do, say whatever he wants to say, but ignore him by treating him as if he wasn't there. Don't speak to him or do anything to cooperate with him." When the Buddha did eventually pass away, all the monks did what the Buddha had instructed, and within a very short period of time, Channa became like an outcast in the community. Eventually, Channa came groveling back to Ananta, pleading, "Please be a refuge to me. I will stop being stubborn." Consequently, all the monks had a meeting and decided to forgive him. As a result of everyone treating him in the same way, he could soon realize his mistake and change his ways, soon afterwards being able to reach enlightenment as an arahant. So if you have a stubborn child in your family and you're a parent, then perhaps you can use the same Brahmadaṇḍa technique as a punishment for the child's acting out. However, if your parents are stubborn as a child, using this technique might not be quite as appropriate. So in conclusion for today, there are 3 main levels of mastery of being open to criticism. If a person realizes that they are still very stubborn, then they should at least try to hear out criticism. If a person realizes that they are only fairly stubborn, then you should try to at least follow the advice given. And if you are put in such a situation and you still feel irritated, try biting your lip instead of answering back, and you will build up a habit of becoming a better listener. If you can resist answering back but can still not bring yourself to follow their advice, at least you keep the channel open for improvement in the future. Finally, if a person has to a large extent freed themselves from stubbornness, apart from hearing out criticism and following it, they should also try to express appreciation for the goodwill of the person who has given the advice, no matter how apparently flawed that person might be. So in this session, I have introduced to you Blessing 28 on openness to criticism. For my next live session online, which will, fingers crossed, be a week on Sunday morning, we'll continue the 3rd blessing of the 8th group with Blessing 29 on the sight of a true monk. For good measure, I'd like to remind viewers that you can email your questions about meditation or what you have heard in the lecture to the email address that you can see spelled out in the slide, and I'll do my best to answer these on my next session. In the meantime, try to avoid recklessness or complacency as we continue to deal with the knock-on health and social effects of the pandemic. Maintain a positive mood, speak only positive words, forgive others, extend good wishes to others, and meditate daily. Hopefully, as a result of today's session, you will manage to overcome any stubbornness still remaining in your character and accept criticism more gracefully. So for today, this is me, Phra Nicholas Thanissaro, signing off for now. So long, folks, and stay safe.